Hello, everyone. Greetings. My name is Jason Morgan. I've been asked by the Oken Gakkai uh, organization to make a short video about Napoleon. 今日は、英語で発表させていただきますが、日本語版もございますので、どうぞご覧ください。内容はほぼ同じです。英語の方は、もう少々短いと思います。日本語の方は内容、コンテンツが、もうちょっと豊富で、どうぞご覧ください。Today's video will be rather short. I'm going to be giving a very short introduction to Napoleon and how I see him in history and also his significance for the present. And I'll also be discussing globalism, which I think is very well represented by Napoleon, the things that he did in his life. Why I have been asked to speak about Napoleon is perhaps a bit surprising. As you know, I am an American, and I don't have any connection to Napoleon. Napoleon was, of course, from France, or from Corsica, but he's of course known as the leader of the Grande Armée, the French army as it moved across Europe and into Russia. It's not much of a connection you might think between Napoleon and myself, but actually there is kind of a connection, at least an indirect one. I was born and raised in the state of Louisiana in the United States, and Louisiana was purchased by the Americans from Napoleon, or from France, in 1803. And so the territory in which I was born and raised is in the United States because Napoleon sold it to the president at the time, Thomas Jefferson. And so I have a bit of a Napoleon, not really a connection, but there is some sort of a reason why I am speaking about Napoleon, however tenuous that reason might be. The reason I think the Louisiana Purchase is interesting and why it pertains to our lives today is because it signals a shift in the way that European powers, especially Napoleon, conceived of conquest. Until the French Revolution, until the rise of Napoleon, much of the conquest of North America and the rest of the world had been territorial conquest. And of course, there was competition among European states, competition among the French and the British, and the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish. Pardon me. There was competition among the great European powers for control over North America, South America, Pacific Islands, Egypt, Africa. There was fighting among the Europeans about India, the Southeast Asia, the Straits of Malacca, what became Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. There had been much competition about among European powers about control of territory. But Napoleon's sale of Louisiana to the Americans is significant because it signals that Napoleon is no longer interested in territory so much as ideology. I think this is probably the main lesson of Napoleon and of the French Revolution in general, of which Napoleon is the heir. He is definitely the exporter of the French Revolution, you might say. Napoleon is the import-export company for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The French and the English had waged a horrible war in North America, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, over control of North America. And the reason that Quebec is still a French-speaking part of Canada is because the French controlled it. And the English and the French did intense battle, not just in North America. It was the First World War, I think. It's the First World War, in my interpretation, was not in 1914. It was the the conflict between the French and the British over control of not just North America, but there was fighting at sea. There was fighting throughout territories held by both countries. There was intrigue in other countries with which side a prince or a polity would align. It was a world war, in my opinion. The struggle for North America was a battle of territory, and it was largely because of the expenses that Britain incurred in defending North America from France, that the colonists had to pay more taxes. The French and Indian War was ruinously expensive, and the supply chain stretched all the way from England to North America. It's not that easy to ferry troops and supplies across the Atlantic, relying solely on wind power. Scurvy, not yet understood. It's not easy, and it involves enormous expense, and that's why the taxes were raised on the colonists. That precipitated an entirely different crisis with the American independence movement, and then eventually the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the establishment of the United States. And it was that fledgling country that bought out the remaining holdings of France in North America. It was also very expensive for France, and it had its own set of consequences in France. I'm not saying the French Revolution was caused by the French and Indian War, but a lot of the final dissolution of Louis XVI's administration under Jacques Necker, if you remember, was based upon this financial breakdown. The coffers were empty, the fisc was depleted, and France had to find more revenue. But for various reasons internal to French politics and society, France was not able to adjust to the challenges that were presented by its colonial holdings, and so it collapsed, or it was taken over by ideologues, and in a total world disaster, of which France was the first victim. As my friend Paul de Lacvivier likes to say, the French Revolution, the first victim of the French Revolution was France. And from there, the chaos of the French Revolution, it's a history we're not going to go into today, but the chaos of the French Revolution produced the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction and the War of the Vendée and Robespierre and the guillotine and ideological purges and the supreme being and taking over of churches. And it eventually produced the Concordat of 1801, the Concordat. And this is one of Napoleon's first moves. This is while he is still the leader of the Republic, of the Consulate. The Consulate. If you remember, there were three leaders in Napoleon, of which Napoleon was one. And he negotiated a surrender treaty with the Catholic Church, very similar to the treaty that the Vatican has, the deal the Vatican has with the People's Republic of China today. The state was officially in charge of the church. Now that the civil arrangement that priests were forced to sign under the French Revolution, that was reneged, that was abrogated, and many of the priests that had fled the revolution were able to return. But in form, the state was in control of the Catholic Church and had power to appoint bishops. And even today, if I understand correctly, the state is the owner, the nominal owner of the church property in France. The revolution stole an enormous amount of property from the church. The revolutionaries did, much like Henry VIII in England before. The state just stole church property, just took it and never gave it back. When the Church of Notre Dame burned a couple of years ago, very tragically, the roof caught on fire. It was heartbreaking to watch. The president of France saying, we're going to rebuild. Why is the president talking about a church? Well, because the state owns the church. It belongs to the state, and that's a legacy of the French Revolution. That's a legacy of Napoleon. Is that the state is above the church? That's what modernism is. That's what globalism is. That's how I interpret Napoleon as the harbinger of this new dynamic in which it's not the church is above the state, but it's flipped. The state is above the church, and that's Napoleon. So Napoleon sells off Louisiana territory, which is basically the Mississippi River Basin. It's a gigantic swath of territory. It nearly doubled the size of the United States at that time. And if you look at the map, it's about the middle third or fourth of the United States. It's the Mississippi River Basin, which is enormous. It goes all the way up through sort of Minnesota. Today it's Minnesota, Missouri, down through the very narrow strip into what's today Louisiana, and down to the mouth. And New Orleans, where I'm from, is near the mouth of the river, the Mississippi River. But I've actually been to the origin of the Mississippi River, which is up near Bemidji, Minnesota, and it's just a little trickle. It's a little stream, and that all the headwaters of the Mississippi flow in and make the gigantic, the mighty Mississippi River at New Orleans, and that entire basin was claimed by France. It wasn't controlled entirely by France, but it was claimed by France. They had a legitimate claim to it according to the international law of the day, and Napoleon dispensed with that claim for about $15 million, which was an enormous sum at the time. Now it's nothing. You can't see a movie for $15 million today, but at the time it was an enormous amount of money. Jefferson was he was heavily criticized for spending that much money. Whether he had the authority to do so is questionable. In many ways, he kind of invented the authority to make that purchase. But at any rate, Napoleon was selling off land because he didn't want land so much as he wanted ideological control, and that's the lesson, I think, of the Louisiana Purchase, is that Napoleon was henceforth an ideologue, a globalist. He was trying to bring the entire world under a new kind of control, ideological control, which denies human nature and which is predicated upon power. Leo Strauss, a very famous political philosopher, has a very interesting analysis of the three turns of modernity, and he sees the figure of Machiavelli as being very important in modernity, in the turn to the modern politics. Machiavelli denied that politics had anything to do with virtue or right and wrong. If you read the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, if you read actually a lot of the political philosophy from early China, apart from the Han Feizi, but if you read political philosophy also from Japan, also if you read political philosophy from the sort of the early and then the high Islamic caliphates, a lot of it is moral. It accepts man as a given. Jewish philosophy is I think probably the best in the world in this. It accepts man as a given. Man is who he is, and man cannot be changed, but man can be taught. And you have to spend your whole life pursuing virtue. That's basically the lesson of the Nicomachean Ethics, which I thought I had around here somewhere. It's buried under one of these stacks of books. But the lesson of the Nicomachean Ethics is that man spends his whole life in pursuit of virtue, and that's politics. Aristotle's politics is the pursuit of virtue, that you're entering into society, but what you're really doing is trying to perfect you're following the good. You're trying to do what is good and virtuous, and by doing that, you can become happy. But you can't steal things and be happy. You can't go out and kill people and be happy. That's not how it works. This one of the Platonic dialogues with Socrates um, is all about whether the just man can also be unvirtuous or not. And of course, whether the unjust man can be happy. And of course, Socrates' ultimate answer is that no, the unjust man cannot be happy. You cannot do what is wrong and then expect to be happy, because happiness has a moral valence. Happiness is part of the good, and ultimately, see in Vienna in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was an attempt to redefine ethics. Moore was one of these later philosophers who was trying to redefine ethics, and you cannot define the good. You cannot define the good, and I think it's because ultimately the good is a person. The good is Jesus Christ. You cannot define him. You cannot boil him down into some sort of political principle. It just simply doesn't work. It's been tried many, many times. It's been tried by Hegel, who tried to bring the good out of heaven, as it said. It's been tried by the utilitarians, by John Stuart Mill, by Jeremy Bentham, who tried to see the good as simply pleasure, or as the maximum amount of pleasure for the maximum amount of people, sort of algebraic good. That's not the good that Aristotle knew. It's not the good that St. Thomas Aquinas knew. The good was something transcendent. It was something that man pursued but did not own, could not possess, but was made to know, was made in which man was made to abide. I think this is the lesson of St. Augustine, City of God and City of Man. The good is not here, finally. The good is somewhere else. But for the French revolutionary ideologues, man was not just man was a blank slate, and he was to be remade into something perfect according to their standards. And they were impatient with human nature. They had no time for who man really is. And they denied that he had any sort of given state. And Napoleon was an ideologue, and so he went around Europe trying to impose the Napoleonic Code, for example, the Concordat, by which he brought the church, led by Pius VII at the time, under control. He got rid of the territories in North America on the assumption that he would not probably be able to conquer something that was already probably under the sway of the American government. And he instituted, I think, the reign of what is today globalism. George Soros, Bill Gates, the United Nations, these people, these institutions, these are Napoleonic, fully Napoleonic. Globalism is a replacement of the true globalism of the church with a fake globalism of ideology. The meaning of the word Catholic is kataholos, that in all of human diversity, the church enters into human life and is the body of Christ, and this is how we are all one in Christ. That's the understanding of the church. That's the basic teaching of the church. We are not all one in the United Nations. We're not all one in the Pax Americana. We're not all one in free trade. We're not all one in 5G. We're not all one in whatever ideology of the day. We're not all one Facebook and Twitter. We're not e pluribus unum. We're not all one in Washington. That's also a fake globalism. The United States was founded by Masons. It's a Masonic heresy. The founding of the United States, George Washington was a Mason. A lot of these people were Masons. They had no interest in the Catholic Church as the true home of mankind. They shared a lot of the same spirit as the French revolutionaries. Edmund Burke, the famous Irish philosopher, tried to distinguish between the two. American Revolution good, French Revolution bad. I don't think you can draw that line. I think Burke was engaging in special pleading. the only globalism that's valid is the Catholic Church, and every other globalism is fake, and it leads to tyranny, dictatorship, misery, war, suffering, death. Every globalism that has been tried, that will ever be tried, is going to destroy man. And I think that's because this is something that I can say here at the Oken Gakkai is because the first globalist was Satan. Satan, the what the devil did, the Miltonian celebrated devil, what the devil did was try to replace God with himself. And that's precisely what Napoleon did as well. There's a famous scene when Napoleon was being crowned emperor by the Pope, and he takes the crown and puts it on his own head, puts it on the head of Empress Josephine. And the implication is very clear that the power to rule comes from me, not from God. It comes from me. That's Miltonian. That's the same malign spirit that animated Martin Luther and John Calvin, and that still works today in Washington, Beijing, all the capitals of the world where power is worshipped. Power. That power is not the power of God. It's not considered to be borrowed from God. As St. Paul wrote, the powers are not considered to be under the control of God. They're considered to be sui generis, and the strong man wins. And so you have, whereas under a Catholic king, you would never have had the kind of tyranny that you have now under Twitter and Facebook, because those places, they scoff at God. They don't think that there's any higher power than themselves or than their woke ideology or whatever the thought du jour is the fleeting source of their power. And it's fake globalism. It's everywhere. And in many ways it began with Napoleon. And it began really with the Louisiana Purchase, when Napoleon said, I'm not going to engage in territorial conquest anymore. Those days are over. From here on, it's ideological. And the Concordat, the Napoleonic Code, which still forms the basis of law in Louisiana today. If you want to go to law school in Louisiana, it's totally different than if you want to go to law school in another state, because the law is just very different. Napoleonic Code and the common law in the other states. The Congress of Vienna, which was convened in 1814, 1815 to try to deal with post-Napoleonic Europe. In many ways, that's also a beginning of globalism. Napoleon, even when people were trying to stop the globalism that he started, they were perpetuating it, even unwittingly. Napoleon is often worshipped as a strong man. Hegel and Beethoven at first, later he changed his mind, but these people thought Napoleon was a conquering hero. But Napoleon was a conquering devil in many ways. He was interested in bringing the entire world under the sway of his own power. He was not. I don't think that he was as completely twisted and insane as later power-mad groups like the National Socialists or the Bolsheviks. But I think in his megalomania, his rejection of God, in his replacement of tradition and history with himself, and his at the time what would have been woke ideology. The French Revolution was uber woke ideology in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. This made Napoleon a representative globalist. One of the models of the globalism, the fake globalism, the anti-Catholic globalism that we see today. This is a brief overview of Napoleon. There's obviously a lot more to read, discover about Napoleon. If you're interested, there is no shortage of books about the man, but the connections between then and now, I think, are very interesting, very pertinent, especially today. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been instructive. I will look forward to speaking with you next time.